Let's bring in now Professor Hugh White, eminent Professor of Strategic Studies at the ANU. Thank you for your time. You've got a quarterly essay out today, Professor White, Sleepwalk to War, Australia's Unthinking Alliance with America. The thesis is that we're not thinking carefully enough about this new, more aggressive, more powerful China. What do we need to be doing in your mind?
Well, I think, the challenge we face is that we're dealing in China with a kind of country we've never dealt with before. Australia's never faced a country in Asia as powerful as China is today. America's never faced a country in Asia as powerful as China is today. And the question we've got to ask ourselves is, how do we respond to that? Now, our instincts are to try and push back and try and contain China and push it back to being the kind of country it used to be, a country that was prepared to go along with the US-led global order and US leadership in Asia. But that's not working. China is too powerful to push back into a box like that. I think we're going to have to learn to live and work with that China. We need to work with it in a way that doesn't undermine our most important values in our political system and so on. But I think we don't want to overstate how big a challenge it poses. And on the other hand, we don't want to push back so hard that we find ourselves in a conflict. And I think that what the Ukraine tragedy has shown us is that powerful countries are willing to go to war to assert their view of themselves as great powers. And I think the risks in Asia are high as they are in Europe, and the consequences could be even worse because China is, in the long run, a much more powerful country than Russia is.
And more powerful in an economic sense, you argue, than the USA. By 2035, this number that you referred to, the USA will be 14% of global GDP. China will be 25% of global GDP. I guess the counter-argument to that, Professor White, would be, isn't the US still going to be the strongest military, though, for the foreseeable future?
Well, that's what we've all been, so to speak, acculturated into thinking, that the United States is simply unbeatable militarily. But that's only half true. Nobody can beat the United States in projecting power around the globe. But fighting in its own backyard, China is very well placed to give the United States a run for its money. In particular, the United States was always a dominant maritime power, air and naval power in the Western Pacific. But over the last 20 years, China has built up very large and very good air and naval forces. And today it can fight the United States to a standstill in its own ground in East Asia and the Western Pacific. And so, for example, if there was a conflict over Taiwan, it's no longer the case, as it would have been 20 years ago, that the United States would have been pretty sure of a quick and easy victory. Today, I think by far and away the most likely outcome is they'd fight themselves to a standstill in a conventional war, and that means that both sides would have incentives to reach for nuclear weapons to break that stalemate, and that's where things get really dangerous. This could easily become the worst war in history.
Yeah, so this catastrophic war is the prospect of a catastrophic war is a real risk in your mind, given these strategic rivalries.
Absolutely. I mean, at the end of the Cold War, where we lived through 45 years of, superpower head-to-head confrontation. When that was over, we tended to think, okay, that sort of thing doesn't happen anymore. Great powers don't confront one another, and nuclear weapons aren't as important or as scary as we thought they were. That turns out to be wrong. We're back into the bad old world of power politics between powerful states as they compete for leadership and influence. And they are armed with nuclear weapons. The nuclear weapons never went away. And I think in some ways the risk of a conflict occurring between great powers and then escalating to a nuclear war are higher than they were during the Cold War because the stakes are less clear. During the Cold War, the great thing that kept the peace in the Cold War was that both sides were sure the other side would fight back. The risk we face today in Asia, for example, is that the Chinese might well think that the Americans wouldn't fight for Taiwan, and the Americans might well think the Chinese would back off in the face of American power. And if they're both wrong, then it becomes a little bit like what happened at the beginning of the First World War in 1914. Both sides thought the other side would back off. Neither side did. We ended up with an absolute catastrophe.
And you're adamant that China will not back off and accept American primacy in the region. I guess it's an interesting release time for the book with NATO meeting, the G7 with this new initiative to try and combat China's Belt and Road. But you're saying all of that's okay, it's fine, but they've got to accept the fact that China won't cop US primacy in our region.
That's exactly right, Kieran. The fact is, of course, we should be doing all sorts of things to maximise Western influence, and I think the kinds of things they've talked about at the G7, I guess the sorts of things they'll be talking about at NATO, they're all good ideas. But we want to be realistic that the outcome we should be aiming for is not to try and push China back into what it used to be, the China that was prepared to live with American leadership. I think we have to recognise that China is going to be the most powerful country in East Asia, the most influential country in East Asia. We need to be very realistic about the fact that we can't entirely push it back economically or diplomatically or militarily. It's become too strong in all three of those dimensions. So what we need to do is to think of a way to live with a more powerful China and do what we can to protect our interests and protect our own national style in the face of China's power. Now, I don't think that's impossible. I think in some ways, some of our debate here has got a bit sort of exaggerated about how big a threat China poses, the kind of silent invasion idea. It's not that serious. It's going to be tough. It's going to be difficult. It's new for us because Asia's always, since European settlement at least, we've always had an Asia dominated by first Britain and then America. It will be new for us to have China as the most powerful country in the region. But I don't think we need to despair about it. We just need to get our act together. Very importantly, we need to make sure we don't find ourselves drifting into a catastrophic war in the process.
And a couple of questions on that. So the Taiwan situation, what are the prospects of the US saying, you know, they've talked up, a big game for a long time, saying they will defend Taiwan against invasion, but when that scenario is looking real, that nuclear war could evolve, will they actually do that? And secondly, I guess we extrapolate that to our own discussion about our own defence then, and then is AUKUS, you're not convinced about that as a strategic setup?
Now, look, really important questions. The thing about Taiwan is it's become the key sort of symbolic issue as to which of America and China is a dominant power in East Asia. China, I think, is convinced that if they can have their way with Taiwan, bring Taiwan, as they would say, back into China, in the face of America's opposition, it proves that they're the leading power in the region. And America believes that if they can stop the Chinese doing that, it proves that America is still the leading power in the region. So what's important about Taiwan is not just Taiwan itself, although of course that's very important, but the way it symbolises which of those two competing great powers exercises primacy. And I think the risk is that the Americans will be very keen, as you say, they talk a big game about it, to try and deter the Chinese. But if that fails, if the Chinese actually do fight, and I think there's a strong chance that they will, then America will face a really terrible choice. Because on the one hand, it's put all of its credibility on the idea that it would defend Taiwan. On the other hand, I think they probably understand in Washington, that's a war they can't win. They can't win it as a conventional war, and if it turns into a nuclear war, then the stakes are going to be too high for it to be worth America's while. Then that makes it a very dangerous approach that the Americans are taking. And on the other side, what that means for us is that AUKUS has got, I think, some very real dangers, because right at the heart of AUKUS is a really close alignment of Australia's military agenda and strategic agenda in Asia with America's. I think America's strategic agenda, the idea that it can deter China militarily and if push comes to shove, fight China in order to preserve US primacy, I think that's a mistaken approach. I think we have to accept that China is going to play a bigger role. And so to align ourselves more closely with US policy in Asia at a time when US policy in Asia doesn't seem to have a coherent foundation is a mistake. We need to be working harder to build a more independent strategic and diplomatic posture for ourselves in Asia and work more closely with countries in the region.
Professor Hugh White, appreciate your insights and your quarterly essay. Well, congratulations on your latest essay, and thanks for your time today. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks, Kieran.